Most Podern 팟캐스트.
Welcome to the Most Podern podcast. Today, we're thrilled to have Gray Lee, a leader in sustainability and resilience in the built environment. Gray brings over 20 years of experience guiding the real estate industry towards sustainability goals, facilitating development projects, and strategizing urban revitalization. He's a sustainability specialist at S&P Global's new venture, Sustainable One. He supports client engagement across a broad array of sustainability solutions and is also the creator and instructor of the popular Harvard Extension School course called Green Buildings, Urban Resilience, and Sustainability in Communities, educating a global audience each year. Welcome, Gray.
Hey, thank you very much, Minku. Thanks, Alex and Lebo. It's great to meet you all. I'm excited to talk with you this afternoon.
Thank you. So sustainability and ESG are hot topics these days, but their broad scope often leads to surface level discussions or misunderstandings. For the benefit of our listeners, could you start by explaining what sustainability and ESG really mean and how they impact our daily lives and why they are so crucial?
What do they really mean? Gosh, you need to convene a congressional hearing actually to understand these terms. Sustainability for me is different from ESG. There's a couple of crucial differences. Sustainability for me is multifaceted, but goes back to this notion of meeting the needs of all indefinitely into the future without sacrificing the needs of those of today. And that kind of a statement, that's not exactly the Brundtland 1987 definition, but it is similar enough. And it has a lot to unpack. Intergenerational justice, social justice, and social equity, and doesn't really get into what most people think about with sustainability around ecology and operating a human economy within ecological boundaries. But that's all part of sustainability to me. ESG, for me, means environmental, social, and governance metrics it's a catchphrase for a lot of different processes that roll up into an E or S or a G dimension related to corporate performance and risk management. And so quickly, when you ask the question, what's ESG and what's sustainability, we get into the notion of materiality and double materiality. And what I think ESG is really looking at is how an actor, mostly a corporate, that's what I mostly think about, a corporate, including a financial institution, but it could be a government or a household, it could be any entity. How are you monitoring performance to manage risks that emerge in those arenas of environmental, like interaction with the environment or interaction with your community, or what is your process for managing risks in the leadership arena? So that would be governance. So ESG is often lately conflated with sustainability, and that is a problem.
But it seems like one leads to the another, or the ESG component is one way you can measure your impact of sustainability?
Yeah, it is two ways of looking at something, but I think people have been using the term ESG to imply impact when it's really managing risks of the blowback of the impact that you're making. So a clearer example of an ESG risk is, this one I work on a lot, is transition risk. The notion that as climate change and environmental degradation proceed, governments, societies, and then ultimately their governments will respond and have been responding with things like cap and trade systems for greenhouse gas emissions or a carbon tax in some places. That it hasn't happened everywhere, and that it started with low cost interventions. We anticipate the growing tenor of climate change to generate a stronger policy response. That policy response has a cost to a company. And so managing that risk by decarbonizing is important, and may be important to certain investors more than others, depending on their anticipated timeline of those transitions. So that is a company responding to ESG by managing transition risk through decarbonization is not the same as trying to be a sustainable company because it's a good thing to do. It's slightly different. It's two ways of coming at the same thing. At the end of the day, if ESG engenders strong sustainability performance, I think that's great. But they are different.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful to clarify, because I think, at least in my perspective, maybe you guys feel the same way. You kind of treat them the same way, and you have a similar sort of reaction to when you hear about sustainability versus ESG.
You completed your undergrad in environmental studies at University of Vermont in the 90s. I'm sure a lot has changed since then in terms of climate and the environment overall. Can you share what you learned during your studies and how that foundation helped you build your career to where you are now?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. My undergrad was in environmental studies in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at UVM, University of Vermont. In Vermont, University of Vermont in particular, are known as environmental leaders, or the brand is related to outdoors and nature, and now a lot of sustainability oriented actions, being the new climate super fund in Vermont, which will be pursuing heavy carbon emitters to fund a climate mitigation and adaptation entity in Vermont to respond to climate change. So when I was there 30 years ago, it was early stages of climate change engagement, and it was environmentalism mostly in the white savior mode of, we got to save these little animals and protect, stop extinctions and that kind of stuff. Social equity was not really in the conversation at that time. Although on that campus when I was there, that conversation of diversity and social equity was happening, but not really connected to the environmental scene in a structural way that I can remember. So I think it was formative for me to be in that space with strong eco activists. I remember I was organizing a thing called the Earth Fest on Earth Day in, must have been 93 or 94. And we had Earth Firsters that were living in Burlington that weren't necessarily on the campus. And we had all these campus groups around this pavilion. And the Earth Firsters had sort of taken over a booth. Like, some student group was allowing the Earth Firsters to kind of hang out there, and they were older and more aggressive than the students, kind of. And this woman had a megaphone, and she was saying, "Attention all students, get the F off the planet. You're destroying the Earth. Attention, students, get the F off the planet." And she wasn't using the F, right? And people coming to me, "Craig, do you think that's appropriate? Is that necessary? Do we have?" And I had a little conversation, and I just got megaphoned in the face. And I said, "Okay, thank you. This event will just go on." And it was part of the advancement of my understanding of the wide spectrum of engagement on sustainability.
I have a similar type of experience. Actually, recently, we were doing a geotech study, and we were doing pilings on the site. A lady passes by and say, "Hey, why are you hurting the Earth?"
Yeah. Like, we're just trying to do research. Just trying to get some data.
Yeah, just trying to get some soil data, that's all.
In order to help heal the Earth, right? So
yeah,
there's obviously a wide range of perspectives on how to embrace sustainability and the effort to turn things around towards a just economy, a just society. And of course, yes, also to save all the little animals. But I think the conversation is much broader now, and that we're appealing to people on that emotional basis, that I want to do something because I care about these people or these animals or whatever they are. But also, in my world now, it's evolved to, how can we do this appealing to people's standard operating procedure? Because there's only so many folks that are really going to engage with a moral suasion of, it's the right thing to do, or let's be compassionate. So ESG has really stepped into that space of saying, well, we want to do these things because it supports the ongoing advancement of human progress. Non-eco people are saying, if you put a tax on carbon, that hurts people that are just trying to build a small house in a country where they don't want to live in a tin shack. They want to live in a house, and putting a cost on the materials to do that is an injustice. And then you're like, but if we don't have a tax on carbon, then the atmosphere is going to melt the house. I'm being facetious, but they are all related. But there's a temporal dimension to how and when we make these interventions, and how do we redistribute the cost or the pain and enable the benefits to be experienced by more and more people. So it's a tough challenge, but I think many good people are working on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like nowadays we have to fit in with existing incentive structures. The protester who was saying just get off the planet, well, that would be great. We could solve climate change if everyone just disappeared, right? There wouldn't be these man-made repercussions. That's the what. Okay, how do we reduce our impact? But the question really becomes how. And I think what you're talking about, Gray, is the conversation has evolved to how not only can we do that at a technological level, but how we can also do that at a societal level to make sure that any corporation who's having an impact on the world is doing it, I guess, responsibly, or is doing it in a way that is incentivized. Is that right?
The self-preservation incentive is strong, and market share preservation is strong. And so that is what we're trying to harness, because people are by and large not interested in going back, so to speak. Even if the voluntary simplicity movement has many wonderful people involved in it, people are looking for more and more creature comforts, it seems, over in that, like, that's a big trend. And for the environmental advocates to kind of get in the way of that is counterproductive, is going to be an uphill battle. So looking at the ways that we use ESG data to identify opportunities for businesses is where my company comes in. We're saying there's a transition happening. There's like hard physical risk that you need to respond to. That's redrawing the map of what's a good real estate investment area, macroeconomic. And then also, here's a design will mitigate risks that we can already start to quantify. Not everyone feels that they're priced into the market, but we see them, we're experiencing them. There's a heat wave in Massachusetts, there's a storm in Texas. We can design things slightly differently. And if you get ahead of those risks and convey how this new building is going to reduce those types of risk and reduce the anticipated costs of those hazards and perils, that's a better asset. That's a better investment. You're a better designer to be able to do that more rapidly. You respond to that challenge faster. So we try to say ESG is corporate performance metrics that anticipate financial performance. It's just we didn't used to have the data. It was all anecdotes. You would, that part of town always floods. And now we're saying, well, actually the trend was this, and now what we're anticipating with climate forcing, we're seeing it's going to go this way. You need to divest from that area or build in a different way. And we're quantifying these aspects of performance, plan better for financial performance, which many people are strongly involved. So it's not just the production actors, it's also those stakeholders that are investors, regulators, future customers, neighbors that need maybe some relocation funding or something. So there's a lot of different ways that you can capture the positive externalities of this transition, not just pay for the negative externalities.
What made you particularly drawn to that field?
It was an interesting thing. Over the last 10 years, we've seen sustainability as EH&S, environmental health and safety, regulation, monitoring, and management shift. It kind of is evolving at the same time as corporate responsibility. And that kind of marketing thing to say, we're a good company, you should shop with us or buy us because we do the right thing. And ultimately, that's kind of what the green building movement was. But the product is just, doesn't fit in a bag, right? It's just this huge buildings. But still trying to appeal to people for this these positive attributes. But that led me into this working with executives in the real estate industry who were not just focused on the design and interaction with tenants, but actually investor relations. That it's kind of like when I was a student, I guess I was a grad student at that time, looking for an apartment in a city. I think it might have been Boston, but it might have been London. But I was working with brokers to help me find an apartment. And somewhere along the line, I realized that the brokers, when you're naive, you think, oh, this is great. This guy's trying to help me. The brokers were not helping me. They were helping landlords find me. And I was like, whoa, what just happened? And this is the same thing happened to me. I did not know about investor relations until 10 years ago, not really what they were doing until maybe, there's this whole pandemic time warp. So it's hard to tell when these things happen now. Real estate operators are always hustling to get tenants, trying to find the best corporate tenants that want these high value amenities like green, plant walls and stuff. And all of a sudden I noticed actually what they're trying to do is sustain the stock price for investors and trying to get institutional investors to hold on to the stock through thick and thin and think about how are we the best institutional quality real estate for investors. And once I sort of shifted into that zone, that's when I could bring sustainability into that ESG conversation. And I was a subject matter expert in investor relations using ESG as a proxy for superior equities, superior financial instruments, not just a green building rating being a proxy for a best operating asset, which is another conversation. But I think that was the shift. And then S&P just launched Sustainable One. Now it's already 3 years old. So they needed to build out their bench, and they found me. So I shifted from, I guess you could say, real estate sustainability to real estate ESG. And we talked about the differences there earlier. And then corporate ESG writ large. Right now, actually, the last 6 months, I've been working on a project to bring it back to real estate. So now we're looking at how real estate, being 39% of global greenhouse gas emissions, is a big piece of decarbonization for any financial entity, which all have some percentage of alternative assets, being among them being real estate. So any financial institution that, like insurance owning assets or insurance companies or asset managers on behalf of others, pension funds, whoever they may be, they have a lot of real estate, and thinking about how to manage those risks of transition in the real estate portion of their portfolios helps them get to their portfolio-wide net zero goal or whatever sustainability goals they may have.
I just want to clarify something, because you brought up something quite interesting. You're saying that the downstream effects of sort of sustainable buildings are in fact the outcomes for the REITs based on the vacancy or the tenancy of a particular building, right? So the REITs, the real estate investment trust stock value, is based on the financial performance of the real estate product, the asset. And that's based on the occupancy and the amount that people are paying to be in those buildings. And so really what you're saying is that if you create buildings that are nice, that are amenitized, that are sustainable, then you up the amount of, I guess, return that you get. And therefore the final incentive is just to make sure that the total kind of value at the end of that chain is maximized.
Yeah, although so part of that is a high performance building or a super healthy green building is anticipated to attract and retain the best tenants, the highest paying tenants, that the companies that want this type of space for their employees, that are using the space to attract and retain employees. And then that rolls up to a REIT wanting to sustain investor interest and saying, we're managing the risks of the transition in the real estate industry, which is not just climate risk. That we have this whole other work from home, hello everybody, issue. And I just read it's in Minneapolis, it's 30% now. I know in New York it was hovering around 24%. That was something I saw recently.
You're talking about vacancy rates.
Sorry, vacancy rates. And that's like space on the market, right? That's not just when I go to my office, I have 6 desks, right? And there was a time the CEO came into the office one day, he was on tour, and all of a sudden the place was full, the building was hot, like it was noticeable that all those human bodies were affecting what had been the set points that somebody had like brought the HVAC down to or up to, however it goes. So occupancy is a big issue. Sustainability and marketing to people that want that as part of their amenity package is an important tool for real estate to claw back and maintain relevance. And we know green buildings have always, there's a variety of research that has supported the claim that green buildings attract and retain better tenants and achieve higher rents. But we're seeing a shakeout in the whole commercial office demand market. And we will see there will always be people that want to pay the least amount. So there's always going to be class B and C space being occupied to some degree. And then there's going to be a bunch of stuff in the middle that hasn't, the owners can't go down that far. So they're going to sit and wait till the rents come back up. And others that can't compete with the highest and best stuff, which will take more of market share as people scale back what they need, but use the reduced demand for higher quality.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is something that an ESG score of a company can help guide people towards. So you could say, we're offering better space, and then translate that to your investors will be happy that we're managing these risks by continuing to improve and address this market concern for environmentally oriented, healthy space.
Does the, green buildings matter for the tenant side? Because I guess especially for office space, these tenants, I assume, are going to be like large publicly traded companies. I know Meta, the company that I work at, has stopped taking new office space in New York, but they have these very lofty, 2030, 2050 zero carbon goals. Is these buildings, I guess, more attractive for these tenants because it contributes better towards their end goals as well?
Exactly. That's I think a big message that the sustainable design community can leverage to prove their relevance in the shakeout, and to show that this type of a building, if it's not a net zero building and the company has a net zero goal, maybe it shouldn't be on their search list at all, because it's just adding to a headache when there's potentially plenty of options that meet all the other criteria that you need for, fancy and cool and whatever other aspects. That it's like, we don't need to look at a building that's not a net zero building, or that doesn't have certain environmental criteria that support our overarching goals. For a lot of companies, like Meta, there's no physical product. I don't know, maybe they sell baseball caps somewhere, but the footprint is the buildings. It's not energy intensity of production. Okay, so it's data centers, it's office space, and it's laptops. Like for my company, that's like, we're a financial service industry information provider, and our scope 3 emissions, scope 2 emissions are our buildings, but most of our space is leased, so it's mostly scope 3. The buildings are a big part of that, achieving that net zero target. And if your stock is held by a big bank that also has a net zero goal, it kind of cascades through that. So I think those decisions are becoming clearer. And 10 or 15 years ago, LEED was a proxy for a better class A office. But now a LEED certification is not even enough. People are like, well, what is the EUI, or what, just tell me you're net zero. Because if you haven't figured out how to get to net zero, I don't know if we should, do we really need to look, do we need to drive another 20 minutes to find that last piece of the tour this morning to show you another awesome space? We've got 3 net zero options right here. That's enough.
Yeah. So in order to secure or mitigate risk and secure the performance of these corporate missions, what are the more relevant measurements or data that's available out there who, these corporates would consider?
Yeah. How do you quantify this stuff? So interestingly enough, some companies, including my own, do this exercise of aggregating. For us, we have about 120 different questions that potentially have about 1,000 data points, but you don't use all 1,000 for any given industry because you have different questions that are relevant to different industries, to assess the ESG, the metrics that roll up into those divisions, to give a stock, essentially a company or a financial institution, a number. Just like LEAD took all these different criteria, you could get different points. You choose which points you want to pursue, but they rolled up into this aggregate number. And a building with 88 points, any three buildings with 88 points had very different features, but you could generally say that they all were at a certain level of achievement in a certain class of performance and for sustainability. The same thing with a certain amount of wellness, even if the different features aren't the same. With ESG, it's a similar type of process. I think back 20. So I was undergrad, and then I went, did a grad thing, and jumped into this world of hedonic analysis of real estate, right? Looking at the different features and how they add up to the composite value. And that's what ESG scores and LEAD and assessors, appraisers, also do. So the ESG scoring is one way to aggregate those different components and the different data you're asking about, Minku. I think for us in the sustainability realm, the driver is still carbon emissions or CO2 equivalents, which are that's the lion's share of impact that most people are concerned about, but it does sort of dominate. And it's right now we're all having a hard time understanding, well, how do we raise up the other aspects of responsible corporate responsibility around things like diversity or cybersecurity or impact on nature? We're all working on that, but my company, S&P Global Sustainable One, has the ESG scores that we offer to the marketplace. We have some big, wonderful competitors that also have similar stuff. MSCI is one, Sustainalytics is another, ISS is another. You have different ways of quantifying that spectrum of impact and saying, the spectrum of performance, and using that quantification to say you are doing things that will diminish risk in those arenas. You may also be doing something that is a positive impact, but most ESG scores are not quantifying that. So it's simply the financial risk, like what is material to quantifying and responding to financial risks through these precursor performance metrics. In Europe, European regulators are asking people to also look at what we call double materiality. So the second materiality, which is impact on external stakeholders. So that is an arena that will continue to evolve. I think the regulatory arena in the US is not really interested in that at this time, so that we will continue to see voluntary performance, comporting with voluntary efforts to describe impact into the future. And that would be something like LEAD. But for corporates, that's the GRI. It's a global system, global reporting initiative, but it is most likely to be used in North America for impact measurement.
The good old hedonic regression came back.
We
talked about it in season 3 when we talked about the value of design in commercial real estate. And I have a similar question to this. How does design play a role at all in the ESG regression calculations, like in terms of materiality?
I wouldn't say specifically. It's we're not looking at design choices that lead to one EUI versus another, or a LEED certification level or another, because you kind of lose resolution as you move through the gradients. And so we are looking at, do you have a certification, but not what, I guess in some sectors, like in our real estate sector analysis, we do go sort of like one layer down further. It's those design choices, selecting choosing 70 versus 60% fenestration, we're not going to get into that necessarily. Although we know that will lead to potentially be a couple of points in a certification that will lead to a point in one of our criteria that will lead to our score.
I see. So, for instance, if it's a passive house certified building, it gets a extra points versus a non, or what type of certifications
now
are we talking
you're
about?
asking me to dig into the methodology documents, so I'll have to go back to you on that one. But essentially, that's the type of exercise that there's in one space there's a very deep granular analysis of something, but when you go up one level, it's just how many watts per square foot did that change,
Right?
And the next level up, people are just saying it's a rated building or a not rated. It got this score or not.
Right.
It hit one threshold. I guess that's kind of like it's like either or, either or, either or. But when you're up here, there's 50 things that led to it, and you don't necessarily see that unless you drill in.
But I just want to follow up on this. Sorry, Greg. I want to follow up because what's interesting to me about especially dealing with ESG and sustainability in real estate is that it's a product that is very hard to refresh. And we've talked a lot about this on the show, that it's not something that you come out with like a new phone every year and we say, okay, this one's better than last year and the next one will be even better. You're talking about buildings that exist many times especially in downtown cores these days are almost 100 years old, if not older. So I understand that a lot of your work has a sort of diffused effect when it comes to the built environment. Basically, you're establishing the guidelines or the principles within the market that would allow for improvement. But how do you actually anticipate some of these changes to occur given the product that we're dealing with, which is old buildings that are hard and standing still?
Yeah, they're here, and it's 1% turnover a year. New construction, probably some places a little higher. Well, on one hand, there's two drivers of transformation of the built environment. One is tenant preference, and of course we have this big, I don't know if it's an exogenous shock, but the transformation of the occupancy demand curve. And the other is so that's just one part of the market transformation. The market also is people want to be in buildings that have biophilic stuff or healthy or whatever it is. So there's the constant fight to meet the tenant needs. So we do see buildings go through that process, but it's in the aggregate, right? Any given building is only getting recapitalized every 20 years or something, and having like this sudden something dramatic happen. Tenant spaces, maybe that's a 5 to 7 cycle where it was a law office, now it's meta, so transformation is always going to be happening. But the other force in that process is the regulatory arena. So for instance, in New York, local law 97 is driving a lot of attention to energy efficiency to figure out how much carbon this building is emitting, and will it be under the threshold for this age and style of building. And I think everyone anticipates more of that coming along. And Boston just followed suit, and many other cities are doing that. And there's, Boston and New York have this rivalry, right? So it's not just sports, right? It's building regulations even. Those two drivers will continue to push that cycling of the built environment. I think the one right now, though, is really this occupancy issue, and I expect that. And when I'm in New York a couple times a year, I am seeing those 100-year-old office buildings, or some of them are like 50 or 60 years old, getting converted to residential, and that's a real thing. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's like mills were converted to loft spaces. Office spaces are going to be converted to some nice high-end, maybe not condos, but multifamily rentals.
You mentioned earlier when we were talking about, I guess, the tenant desires for an office space about scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding of what that means and how that factors into someone's calculus when they're thinking about space?
So just to go back into what are the three scopes of emissions. So there's a bunch of different nonprofits and international non-governmental organizations that put together the greenhouse gas protocol in the early 2000s. I want to say 2007 maybe, which was like an attempt to say we were trying to do something about greenhouse gas emissions. How do we understand what they are and where they're coming from so that we can address them appropriately? And they split emissions into these three major categories, the three scopes. So scope one is emissions that your entity, your company is like directly transforming something into a greenhouse gas. So it's either burning a fossil fuel or letting a refrigerant into the air. And I think also burning coal creates sulfur dioxide or nitrous oxides as well, which are also greenhouse gas emissions. Scope two is those same emissions from basically the electricity sector, where a utility is burning and creating the greenhouse gas emissions, but you are essentially responsible for them because you're the demand for that electricity. In some cities, a steam plant will also be your scope 2 emissions. It's sort of delivered energy to your entity. So if they're burning, I think if they're burning coal to make the steam, but even if they were using like a massive heat pump, it would still be your scope 2. Scope 3 emissions are emissions that other parties are responsible for, but that you're causing the demand because it's a supply to something you create, or it's fossil fuels that are burned in the thing that you've created. So if an automobile manufacturer has scope 3 emissions, and there's 15 categories of scope 3 emissions that start with sort of like energy used to extract a material, energy used to bring the material to a production zone, energy being used at the production zone, energy being fossil fuels being emitted, greenhouse gases being emitted in the energy used to transform a material. And then there's downstream emissions as well, to ship the product to somebody, for somebody to use the product. Actually, upstream is also employees commuting to get to the place where they're going to do the thing that creates value for that company. And at the very far end of that is financed emissions as well. So are you responsible? Are you lending money into an energy sector entity that's creating fossil fuels? So with those three scopes and the many categories of scope 3, we're able to address different types of greenhouse gas emissions processes and develop policy and interventions to change how that happens and enable an entity to quantify and focus on certain categories or certain scopes.
So let's say I'm a developer or I'm a building owner. Is my scope 1 and 2 someone else's scope 3?
Yes, and the reverse. Anybody's. Your scope 1 and 2 are somebody else's scope 3, but somebody else's scope 3, your scope 3 or somebody else's scope 1 and 2. And so there's a big debate around how is this all getting counted or multiply counted. But right now we're saying we need to identify where our emissions are coming from. And ultimately, yes, if you went to if your entity was completely net zero, or actually, zero emission, then your products would have a zero emission scope 3 impact on those scope 3 stakeholders. So there's a cascading interest in attaining net zero or even zero emissions, because then you're simplifying the calculation for your stakeholders in either direction. And so I think we will see companies start to add that to RFPs as they're pursuing suppliers or distributors or commercial partners. To what degree can you help us reduce our emissions? So then that goes back to what I was talking about earlier with facility selection. If your company has a big net zero goal, choosing a building that has no emissions is a big piece of that, or could be a big piece of that. If all things considered were, if the amenities were the same, the market will start leading us to choosing that other calculus of the carbon budget.
So we talked about the existing buildings. How about new constructions when you have more flexibility and options to choose from? What do you think will be an ideal new construction project that would meet all the goals, like hit a home run, basically?
What's the super awesome next building? Well, the big thing we haven't talked about yet that is going to have an impact on these calculations is in a new building is the embodied carbon of the materials going into the building and the construction process itself. So there's a lot of different stats out there, but there's this general idea that the construction is about a third of the carbon of the whole building's life cycle. That if buildings are responsible for 39% of carbon emissions, 11% of that is construction, and 28% is the operations. So when you're thinking about decarbonizing, right now we haven't accounted for most of that embodied carbon, but as we start to calculate Scope 3 emissions, any given year where you're involved in a construction project, that's going to be a big nut of your Scope 3 emissions. So there will be an equation around adaptive reuse, repurposing existing buildings versus using all new fresh concrete and steel. So when you say it, I just kind of let the cat out of the bag, Minku, but when you say what's the best green building, of course, it's the building that you don't need to build. But it could be taking an older building and leveraging its existing contribution to the community of the embodied carbon, the cultural significance, and the reduced disruption of tearing something down completely and rebuilding new, but potentially even building, adjusting and improving the building for the new program while it's under occupancy, which may be that may be the silver lining of this occupancy shock, is that we can actually do some of that stuff, moving people around, moving tenants around in buildings. I mean, that's a little far-fetched, but that is a structurally possible thing that used to not be possible. Other features of the dream building, I think, are going to be leveraging biomimicry to bring nature into the building, looking at the ways we can manage climate, manage interior air quality and comfort, indoor environmental quality through natural means, whether that's bringing the outside in with air, with humidity, and facilitating people's engagement with the world around them. I think those are things that we will see more and more people interested in, and that also facilitate higher performance on the carbon or other sort of new metrics, new realms of quantification.
I love it. So not building is the best building.
I mean, unfortunately, it's always kind of been that way. It's a challenge to talk about that with the design profession, because like, well, what are we all supposed to do? But look, there's plenty to do. There's plenty to do, right?
Exactly.
There's many communities where people are in substandard housing, and we need to work on that. There's places that are going through dramatic climate shocks, whether it's fires or storms, and there's places where in active conflict zones where we need to think about how will we rebuild in a way that fosters more resilience, not just physical and climate resilience, but social resilience and social adhesion. So I think there's a lot of things that designers can bring to the built environment in any project, whether it's adaptive reuse or straight up brand new stuff, that will increasingly be attractive to investors as a way of mitigating risks around not just carbon, but impacts on nature and the regulatory response to impacts on nature, and ultimately regulatory response to social inequity. And thinking about, like, can this building be a piece of reparations? Can this building be a piece of climate justice? Can this building be a piece of intergenerational wealth preservation?
Yeah, that's personally why I'm fascinated in this era. You mentioned about the occupancy, like the commercial spaces are struggling, and it's clear that not just Boston, but a lot of cities are seeking for conversions as one, at least a band-aid or an answer to part of the problems that we're facing now. And as an architect and developer, I think those areas are actually a very exciting field to explore. The parts that you mentioned, the ESG aspects of it, but I think architects also can have a more kind of creative role in rethinking about how these buildings can be refit or repurposed for different uses. So I think
Well, it's the
personally that's
role.
an
Yeah, it's
exciting
the
part.
role of the architect that's always been the role of the architect, is the master builder that is bringing the context to the construction. It's not just, will this lintel survive an earthquake, but like how will this building be additive to this community, both in the design phase, the construction phase, in operation phase, and ultimately decommissioning and deconstruction phase. And that's, I think, the atomization of design science, and the separation of engineering, and then all the sub separation that's going on. I think any given architect has the potential to to be aware of all those different aspects and think about how to respond, not just to the program that's needed. Why is the tenant, why is the developer paying for it? Because the tenant wants it in a certain way, right? But also, how does this building meet and anticipate and meet the market in the future, regulatory arena in the future, and the voice of the stakeholders of the future that hasn't manifested as market or regulations yet.
Mm-hmm.
But where's it going?
Well, I think, guys, this is a really fascinating conversation, because I think that one of the issues that I would just speak for on the behalf of the design world is that we tend to not think in terms of what is the project in 5 years. We're always looking for the project that will fill our time sheet right now. And part of that is the way that I think the market has played out over the past 10 to 15 years. You have developers who are building constantly, always, here's the next piece of land. Okay, bring the next architect. Okay, I'm not saying doing architecture was easy. It never was, but it was more predictable in the sense of you kind of knew what the project was going to be. I think an area that architects or anybody involved in the built environment, doesn't mean you have to have design chops, but anybody who's trying to make a difference really can benefit from, is understanding the relationship between implementation, finance, and time. And that it takes a lot of time to develop new ideas, but also to get financial backing for them, to get sort of consensus built around them. And then especially in North America, and I would anticipate in a lot of kind of more older settings, anticipating a regulatory environment that maybe doesn't exist right now, but could exist in the future. So this has made me think that maybe an interesting sort of way at going at it is not necessarily doing unsolicited work, but starting to approach people and saying, this is what you can do with your project, as opposed to waiting for people asking the architect or the designer, what can you do with my building?
Well, so you're making me think about two important things that are going to affect design. One is this notion of universal design, or when I first came across it, it was architecture in the fourth dimension. The idea that, and I'm sorry, there is another universal design concept, but for accessibility. But there's this notion of the ultimately constantly evolving use case for the structure, and that we can design buildings that can be set up better for that inevitability that the use case is going to change, and that we will need to move things around, change entrances. Like I remember 5 years ago, it was about flying delivery drones. Like, how many new openings were we going to have in buildings on the 10th and 20th and 50th floor for this new requirement? And how is that going to mess with air pressure and everything else? But so I think there is that potential to pay attention to the design inevitability, the change of program that every design ultimately has to face. And when you're talking about being proactive, going to developers, and not just being part of this industrialization of design and construction, just transforming space into market requirement. I think there's a big piece of this is where AI comes into this conversation, gentlemen. It's that search and selection filtering process is going to be automated, and developers, the notion that any given developer has some kind of unique insight into what could happen on this weird triangle of land next to the train tracks, but it's, within 800 feet of a school and 50 feet of a wetland and blah, blah, blah. Someone's going to just float that out there, and like the whole surface of the planet is going to have that quantification going on. So, optimizing what would be best to be built here within the existing regulatory regime with that space. So the designer will have a role in reinterpreting what can happen, because design responds to all those criteria in a way that a developer usually just sort of sees a couple of high notes, like, it costs this, and FAR is that, and construction costs per foot, bingo, got a project. And I know some people at Merrill Lynch who got some money or whatever, but I think the designer now has the ability, or will soon have the ability, to drill into the nuances of a site and have that role of uncovering more value than what the back of the envelope guy is doing.
Yeah, it can be the expansion of the designer role, but also asking more from the developer. Like, developers can do more. And if you especially have a design background, maybe like you can even do even more than that.
And the framework of ESG helps you quantify the different stakeholders that can bring value to the table, so that capital stack involves more parties.
Mm-hmm.
And there's there's impact investors that want to support this. There's or artistic priorities for this group of investors. There's redistribution people or social justice people. I mean, like pension funds that are like, we're going to stand up 1% of our total assets under management to support this agenda. And then suddenly that could be a $10 million piece of the pie for a developer on a specific type of project in a specific type of neighborhood. So I think connecting it, like you said, Alex, like connecting it to the finance world is going to take the granularity of what the components represent to different types of investors. Mm-hmm. And it's not a homogenous, just single capital market anymore, because ESG is kind of teasing that out, because different investors have different time frames, different risk profiles, different agendas.
Well, I think that's the optimistic way of looking at it. I think one sobering fact is that as designers, we've talked about this in the past, the agency doesn't lie with the designer anymore because the risk doesn't lie with the designer. So I think that, to me, the finance is really understanding that risk, regardless of if you care about return or not, or if it's financial or otherwise, understanding that there's going to be some failures probably too. Building industry is not quite like the aviation industry. If a plane goes down, that's a huge shockwave to everyone. You ground all those types of planes. People do see what happens, and you kind of have to get it right. If you mess up too many times, people will get cold feet, and they won't say, well, so-and-so tried it. I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to go with what works already. We know developers, designers, building in general is just not the most innovative industry. So it is challenging.
Well, that's probably where the policy can make some change and add some pressure.
Well, I think it has to be everybody, right? Everybody acting together. Mm-hmm. Understanding what motivates each other. And I think, Gray, that's particularly what's interesting to me about what you've been talking about, is that you're creating a framework that everyone can latch on to at some extent. It's not just about, previously it was just about where the capital goes and what the return is, but then there's much broader returns that we should all be considering, or different people can, pick and choose what they care about.
Yeah, that's the big shift that's going on right now, is that the investor realm is really differentiating and using data to identify the different attributes that they want to line up with. And I think while ESG currently is more about risk management of the potential pitfalls of a certain investment thesis, we will see the impact side growing, and we will end up with rankings and scores related to impact. That some of that stuff is mixed in, even with my company's ESG scores. And we do say our ESG scores are addressing double materiality. But you have to get into what we call the raw data. So we sell the score, and then we sell the raw data underneath it. and when you get the score, you have some dimension of raw data, but then you can really get into it with the bonus subscription. But that raw data enables you to tailor what you're observing for that entity to what your investment thesis is. And that, I think that's like this whole new frontier. And it's really exciting that investors will be able to do this differently. And especially as we think about who are the investment stewards. There's this whole thing about the shift from the boomers to millennials, and maybe it's Z's already. I know Gen Xers like me are getting cut out of the deal, but that's fine. Millennials and Zers are more energetic anyway, so more power to them. There's people that are turning their entire inheritances over to charity. There's renouncing this the injustice of that carried wealth. Not that carrying wealth is a bad thing. Like, I want the best for my kids too, but just that we can recognize that there's certain structures of privilege that have been entrenched at the expense of others that we need to sort of work on. So I think that we will have more and more different types of investors, and more of these impact or socially oriented investors, and they will be part of the real estate capital stack. And that's really exciting when you think about how the building, what was that? David Orr was talking about the building as a crystallized pedagogy. Like, if you build a school, a green school that has all these incredible features, you're giving people, the occupants, in this case students, a specific orientation around what the values of the entity or the society may be. And if you just build like that, just put a bunch of prefab structures together for the addition to the school, that's sending a message to those kids, right? So I think architects have had a sense for the impact, like the sociocultural impact of their creations since the first temple was built, whenever it was. Or maybe, was it? No, the first thing that was built was a barn, right? And then the temples resembled the barns. But anyway, the notion of different types of investments is, I think, going to be very exciting for real estate practitioners and designers to say, we can use the power of design to meet the needs of this niche of the capital market, and it will respond to the situation and create a restorative, regenerative facility that we can be proud of.
You talk a lot about kind of not only the framework that you guys are developing, but also other companies. It seems like there's this explosion of frameworks and ways of measurement to kind of address the complexity of this problem. Do you think that's just the outcome of just how complex this problem is, or are we kind of in this discovery period that will eventually have some sort of convergence around maybe 1, 2, or 3 major standards?
I do think we're in that market shakeout experiment right now in terms of ESG quantification and scoring. We have a whole nother conversation about ESG blowback and the conflation of ESG with basically like the anti-fossil fuel agenda. And most ESG blowback is pretty clearly related to petro and oil and gas companies saying, this is just a pain in our ass. You got to stop this. And they line up their state attorney general and you haul people in front of Congress, and it's just a waste of time. Because at the end of the day, market participants want information about the activities that they're engaged in. It's caveat emptor will never end. Like, people will always want to know about stuff. And if we or any entity gives an investor, a real estate developer, or anyone more information about that asset, they can feel more confident making a decision. ESG right now has many different types and providers, but just like people have different ideas around where to put their retirement funds, or different ideas of what type of accountant to use, over time it will streamline down to a simpler equation with a few providers. It may also take some regulatory activity to tighten the parameters of what's being quantified and what is material, what's not material. But we're excited to be part of that process of that evolution and ultimately simplification. But for now, it is complicated, and you need good guidance. Ultimately, people want more information, and we're going to pursue parties that give them the best information, and we'll see where that goes.
So we're heading to the last minute of our conversation, sadly, but I wanted to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk about your course, because I know that education plays a big role in your career as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the course, Green Buildings, Urban Resilience and Sustainability?
So I hope everyone will take a look at the extension school. I think actually, Minku, it is called Transforming the Built Environment for Sustainability. Now it had an earlier name. It keeps changing, keeps evolving, meeting the market. But that is the notion of taking students on an adventure to understand the basics of design, basics of construction, then high performance construction in buildings, and then how buildings interact with each other and create sustainable communities. That arc of adventure helps, I think, people that aren't in the design profession or are new to the design profession understand their potential role in this transformation that's so necessary. And really, not many other parties have such leverage in helping this transformation.
What motivates you as a ESG specialist now in your role, and where do you see the industry headed?
What motivates me is I have deep conviction to support the just transition. I was lucky enough as a young person to live abroad as an exchange student and subsequently travel a lot and see people that were making the most of much less material circumstances than I had. And I feel a duty to respond to that, and that what we're doing with atmospheric chemistry to make everything worse for everybody is just not fair. And it's especially not fair to people that have a lot less to rebuild from and to support themselves in a transition. So that motivates me. Now, I'm not there with a megaphone telling people to just, go away. I think there's a way that we're going to be able to work with what's going on, what people want. We want to set up our home office with a nice microphone, or like, it's okay to spend some money on some things, and yet we can do it better. We can do it in a way that has less impact per unit of human enjoyment. And my little company is helping people do that, to make better decisions using more data around what they're doing and the risks that they run. So that's what is motivating me. What was the other part of the question, Minku?
Where do you see the industry headed?
Yeah, I think, well, we are going to see more green buildings. Let me just say that more green buildings is a thing, and it's because not only will users advocate and prioritize and prefer these, but also now we have the investment world saying this. There's a structural flaw in our economy of these externalities into the atmosphere and other places, and these, like, there is no away anymore. You can't push externalities over there because we have a subsidiary on the other side of the planet that's invested in that market and can't deal with that impact on nature that we're imposing by extracting for our purposes over here or whatever. There's no away anymore to put problems, to throw things away. So because of that integration, global capital integration, investors with the longest perspective, which cascade down to everybody else, are going to ask for better performance. And we can see better performance across multiple metrics using ESG framings, and ultimately help companies make better decisions. So I think we will see more of this data, more familiarity and appreciation of this data. We will see the naysayers go away because the market will, even fossil fuel companies are using ESG to make better decisions, right? So we can just call it something different, but people are going to continue to use expanded corporate performance metrics to improve their bottom line by avoiding risks and meeting the needs of stakeholders. So I'm excited that we're going to continue to grow and help people make the transition real. And the real estate industry is a big part of that, because the impacts of every company are dominated by their facilities. Designers have a big role in helping diminish those impacts through better design choices.
Let's go.
Let's go.
All right. With that, thank you, Gray, for joining our podcast. I'm sure I enjoyed it a lot. I'm sure our team did, and also the listeners out there. So for the listeners, if you haven't subscribed and if you want to listen to more of these type of content, please subscribe and listen to our podcast, Most Podern. We're on Spotify, Apple Music, and on YouTube. Thank you so much, Gray.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Cheers. Take care.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트